Ever wonder why your energy crashes after eating carbs, but you feel unstoppable on a keto diet? It's not just willpower, it's cellular chemistry. What if I told you fat gives you more than triple the energy of sugar and burns cleaner too? Stick around, I'll prove it to you, molecule by molecule. Hi everyone, my name is Marc Bates. I'm a metabolic health coach, and this is part of my question and answer series. Why is fat the superior fuel, and what your doctor never told you about sugar versus fat? Okay, let's get to the question. You mentioned that fat is more efficient than sugar as fuel. Can you walk me through exactly what happens when a fatty acid enters that mitochondrial power plant compared to when glucose enters? What makes one process more efficient than the others? Well, the answer is of course I can. Absolutely. This is a fantastic and foundational question. Let's walk through how glucose and fatty acids are processed inside the mitochondria and why fat is actually a more efficient and cleaner burning fuel than sugar. And once you understand this, you'll never go back to eating that carb-centric lifestyle again, because you'll understand why you want to eat a fat-centric one. Okay, let's get on to this. So, part one, overview of your energy pathways. You have two basic energy pathways. One called the glucose, which is for sugar, right? And remember, starches, anything that comes from essentially a plant is going to be a glucose, okay? And fatty acids, which of course come from fat, primarily hopefully from animal products, right? Because that's the best type of fat to eat. And both are used to make ATP. This is the energy currency of your cells. The end result of all of this work is to produce ATP, and without ATP you have no energy, okay? And the ATP is produced via the mitochondria, and the main pathways inside the mitochondria are for glucose, glycolysis. It's outside the mitochondria. It breaks down the glucose into smaller units that it can work with. Pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, that's inside the mitochondria. It's the first step. Then acetyl-CoA enters the citric acid cycle, or the Krebs cycle, which is why this is called the citric acid or Krebs cycle. You'll see that in a lot of textbooks. And the electrons go to the electron transport chain where ATP is made, and there you have your energy. Okay? And for fatty acids, it starts with beta oxidation, which is inside the mitochondria. Sorry about that. Got tongue-tied there. Which happens inside the mitochondria. The fatty acids go into many acetyl-CoA molecules, and you notice that acetyl-CoA is part of both of them. Okay? Then acetyl-CoA enters the citric acid cycle. Right? It goes through the exact same cycle then. And the electrons go to the electron transport chain, or where ATP is made. So both basically use the same cycle, which is why in the Randall cycle videos, one of the things I keep emphasizing there is that your mitochondria really can only burn either sugar or fat. You can't burn both at the same time. And if you're high on sugar, it prioritizes sugar over burning fat. And so if you're looking to burn some of that body fat, you gotta stop eating sugar. Okay, that's all there is to it. All right, step two, let's look at the comparison between them. Glucose. So glycolysis, which happens in the cytoplasm, one glucose, which is typically 6 carbons, is converted into 2 pyruvates, which are 3 carbons. So it splits it in half, right? That produces 2 ADP and then 2 NADH, which is a byproduct, which is needed. And you get some, this happens anaerobically, which means no oxygen is needed yet. Then the pyruvate is turned into acetyl-CoA, so the glucose is broken into 2 pyruvates. The pyruvates is turned into acetyl-CoA in the mitochondria. That produces 2 NADH, which is, once again, a product that's used later on. Then, in the citric acid cycle, which is often looks like a Ferris wheel going around, the 2 acetyl-CoAs turn into 6 NADHs, 2 FADH2s, and 2 ATP. Okay, so there's your 2 ATP. And then the electron transport change, which comes out of that, is when the NADH and FADH2 donate electrons. That's why they have to be made earlier, right? So they have electrons to donate. It goes through the proton gradient within your cells, and it produces a total of somewhere between 26 and 28 ATP. So your net total per molecule of glucose is about 30 to 32 ATP. Okay, so think of that as units of energy, right? Okay, so fatty acid metabolism. We're going to use palmitate, which is a C18, which means it's a fat molecule, has 16 carbon, though you may also have anywhere from 16 to 18 and so on, right? So the math applies here for each. The first step is beta oxidation. This is each 2-carbon segment is turned into 1 acetyl-CoA, 1 NDH, and 1 FADH2. Remember, and you need those later on to provide electrons for the proton gradient. And then the palmitate will end up giving you 8 acetyl-CoAs, 7 NDHs, and 7 FADH2s. That's just kind of the way that works, right? Then it hits the citric acid cycle, so the 8 acetyl-CoAs turn into 24 NADHs, 8 FADH2s, and 8 ATPs, right? So you get 8 right there. And then you go into the electron transport chain, and all the NADH and the FADH2s are used for ATP synthesis, right? Going through all of that, and what you end up with is a total of between 106 and 108 ATP per palmitate molecule. Now, if the fatty acid has a little bit more or a little bit less carbon, there are a whole bunch of them. You get obviously a little bit more, a little less, but C16 palmitate is considered the standard we base this against. So you get 100, let's call it 106 for 1 molecule of fat versus 30 for 1 molecule of sugar, right? 3 to 1, almost 4 to 1 in some cases, right? Energy benefit. All right. What makes fat more efficient? We talked about that, right? So the ATP is 30 for your glucose. The ATP per molecule is 30 to 32 for glucose, and 106 for per fatty acid using palmitate as the fatty acid, right? Your ATP per carbon, right? It's 5.3 per carbon in glucose and 6.6 per ATP per carbon in fatty acids. You get more ATP per molecule of carbon. Oxygen efficient. Glucose is less efficient, okay? And fatty acids become more efficient. So you get more ATP per molecule of oxygen, O2, that's consumed to do this, okay? Byproducts. Part of the problem with glucose is it can increase your lactate, which is a form of emergency energy for the muscles, okay? But there are prices to be paid to use that as an emergency fuel, where fatty acids have less metabolic acid buildup, okay? So it's much more efficient and clean. And finally, ROSs, reactive oxygen species. This is oxidative stress built within the system. When you burn glucose, you get more when insulin is high, okay? And less when fat adapted. So there are far less ROSs produced in the fatty acid cycle than there is in the glucose portion, okay? So it's cleaner, it's more efficient, it's better for your system. Okay, from a clinical perspective, I'm going to quote a couple of my favorite doctors here. In Brain Energy, the book written by Dr. Chris Palmer, he describes how fatty acid metabolism supports mitochondrial efficiency and reduces reactive oxygen species, critical in mental health conditions. So for his specialty, he really pushes people into ketogenic and fatty acid things. In Why We Get Sick, Dr. Ben Bickman, who's one of my big mentors, he explains how glucose metabolism becomes inefficient in insulin-resistant individuals, while fat oxidation remains robust even when insulin is low. And remember, if you're metabolically unhealthy, you got a little extra around the middle, you're been eating a lot of carbs for the most of your life, you probably have some form of insulin resistance, and that means that your glucose metabolism is not as efficient as it should be anyways. Switching to fat adaptation helps not only clear up the insulin resistance, makes you metabolically flexible, but it's more efficient. Right? And is the point getting through here? Okay, finally, fat gives you more ATP per molecule and per carbon than glucose. Right? So it's more efficient. Fat burns more cleanly with fewer free radicals and byproducts, especially when you're fat adapted. Okay? And fat fuels your mitochondria directly, while glucose requires more steps and creates more metabolic stress under high insulin. Right? That's why a ketogenic or carnivore diet, where fat is the primary fuel, leads to better energy, less inflammation, and better metabolic health. It's how the body was designed to function optimally. Alright. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions about any of that, that's a 30,000 foot overview of cellular biology and ATP production. Let me know. And if you need me to really go in depth, ask me about that, okay? But really, for the average person, that's more than enough that you need to know about why you want to eat fat over sugar, okay? And as always, if you haven't done so, please like, subscribe, share this video with somebody who might need it. It'd be greatly appreciated. It helps the channel greatly.